What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 159. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, I'm very excited to be interviewing Kevin Gosztola. He runs Shadowproof, The Dissenter, and hosts the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Of course, links to all of Kevin's work will be in the show notes page. We have a fantastic conversation about the people who told the truth about the Afghan War, the people who should be held up as the truth tellers and the true experts on the war, but who are often relegated to either the sidelines of conversations or who are just smeared and thrown in prison. And so, great names like Daniel Davis, Matthew Hoh, Daniel Hale, and several others are discussed in this episode. I think all my audience is absolutely going to love it. Kevin's an absolute expert on all these people. He knows their stories and heroically follows the persecution of so many American whistleblowers. So I think you're going to love this show. Be sure to check out Kevin's work. Follow this show on the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. Video version at YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Social media accounts, follow the show. You get the clips that I post there. Twitter at con_interest, and then there are Facebook and MeWe pages. Donate to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar, and then information to crypto is in the show notes pages. If you want to support the show and get yourself some great CBD products, do your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the URL. The promo code is PEACE, PEACE, and when you use the promo code, it gets you 25% off at checkout. They have a great variety of products: soft gels, tinctures, gummies, even products for your dog. But my favorites are their topicals. I use their sports cream almost every day. Very fast pain relief, and it lasts for hours. Not a whole lot of smell, just like a nice menthol smell. Certainly not the ones that you get with the products that you buy at Walgreens or wherever over the counter. And then also not the extreme temperature changes that you get with some of the other products either. So great working products, fast, effective, and you check out their great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. Just use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That gets you 25% off. All right, now let's get into the show. Hey, Kevin, how's it going? Welcome to Conflicts of Interest.
Hey, thanks.
Really excited to have you on today because you have this great article out at your website, Shadowproof, on the Afghan War and the dissenters we should have listened to. And basically, you have the best list here of like 5 or 6 people who were really right on this at very important and key times, and people who just weren't listened to. And so I thought maybe it would be good to start at the beginning, back in 2001. And I'm a libertarian, so sometimes I'll say there was only one person who voted against the 2001 authorization for use of military force, and my audience will assume that I'm talking about Ron Paul. And while he was good on this war from very early on, it was actually only Representative Barbara Lee who voted against it. So tell us a little bit about Representative Lee.
Yeah, Representative Barbara Lee stands out as someone who essentially was in favor of an international law enforcement response to whoever the perpetrators were of 9/11, rather than having an open-ended conflict. And she recognized from the very beginning, and it's reflected in her speech against the vote, or in defense of her no vote, where she says that she basically predicts that they're signing over this blank check to President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney and the rest of the administration at the time, that's going to allow them to wage war in almost any country, so long as they can claim that there are people who are connected to the September 11th attacks, or so they can claim there's some group associated with terrorism that can be loosely connected back to the group that committed this act upon the United States on 9/11. And so she stands out there stands up in the chamber and says that she's going to vote against it. And ever since, for the last 20 years, she had spent working to get the authorization repealed because it remained in force. It was the main justification and reason for behind the I don't know if it's fully legal. Obviously, Ron Paul would be the better person to get involved in something like this. But this was the way the Bush administration claimed it was legal to be invading Afghanistan, was because they had this authorization for the use of military force. And so what happens is she is one of the chief advocates against the war. There are others that join. You mentioned Ron Paul. Walter Jones is someone who's actually a Republican who comes around to being opposed to not only the Afghanistan war, but an opponent of the Iraq war, even though he was a supporter. And I do mention him and a handful of other representatives who form a kind of bipartisan coalition. A kind of, well, in my view, I don't really like the word bipartisan, so I talk about it in terms of transpartisanship in the positive sense of people who are progressives and libertarian Republicans to some degree working across against these wars, because we know that the bulk of the support for these endless wars tend to come from the center, with people who fashion themselves as moderates or they're neoconservatives, or you have people who are centrist liberals or neoliberal types that favor these open-ended wars. And so this small coalition spoke up against the surge when that was a big deal back in 2009 when Barack Obama was first elected. Remember that President Barack Obama came into office claiming that the Afghanistan war was the good war. He was opposed to Iraq. It was easy for him to be opposed to the Iraq war. It was trendy. He gave a speech in Chicago at a rally that was attended by anti-war activists in the city, which is actually where I'm based. And so he let that stand, but he was a defender of the Afghanistan war, even going so far as to, I think even during one of the debates, he advocated for the kinds of incursions we would see into Pakistan, we saw reflected in drone strikes, and he was in favor of that kind of special operations actions, even if they didn't have like an authorization for war against Pakistan. So this moment in 2009, where they're moving to surge troops, there's not really a whole lot of debate. There's a bit of pushback from President Joe Biden at the time he's vice president, but the difference is over 10,000 troops. So don't believe this dishonest representation from President Biden that he was against the surge. He just disagreed about the number, and it only came down to being for 10,000 less troops than President Barack Obama ultimately sent to Afghanistan. So she's been against the surge. These other people in 2009 and around 2010 begin to form more of a political opposition to the Afghanistan war. But it's extremely difficult in the Obama years to be opposed to the Afghanistan war because he dubbed it the good war.
Yeah. And I really like your distinction between bipartisan and transpartisan, because, I hear bipartisan, and to me, that's a scary word. Something bad's probably going to happen from Congress, but the transpartisan stuff, because we do need those kind of coalitions of Republicans and Democrats to push back against this stuff, because the senators of both parties won't do that. One of the things, I guess, that Barbara Lee has done is really fought against this the whole time, and is trying to get it repealed for 20-something years now, and with little success. And so, that's one of the other things that, I think she should really be commended for, is fighting for this the whole time. I remember, I think it was 2016, she held a hearing and had Daniel L. Davis and a couple other really good people, Michael Pearson, I think, is the head of Veterans for Peace. He was there and gave an excellent speech, and she's elevated all these other voices with her opinion. And even if a lot of these hearings I see her host, and she'll like co-host it with, used to be Justin Amash, now it's probably like a Thomas Massey type, but they co-host it, and there's like 4 representatives who show up, maybe a couple others poke their head in for a couple minutes, but yeah, I don't know if you have anything else on Representative Lee or the fight to repeal the 2001 AUMF.
Well, I just say that one of the tremendous difficulties in getting this passed, I think, or one of the reasons why it may not have been so appealing to the anti-war movement to support the AUMF repeal more openly, is because oftentimes, if I may be wrong, if I'm wrong, please go back later and retract this for me. But from my experience following these hearings, it tends to be that they want to put the repeal in like a defense budget or a military budget that's expanding and making the funding even more gargantuan than it already is. And the way they talk about the repeal of this AUMF is to admit that it's outdated and should not have force anymore, but to say that they're going to go back to the drawing board and conceive of a new AUMF that would cover the current state of the world and apply to the latest formations of terrorist groups, such as like ISIS, because they've been trying to apply the AUMF to any sort of operations they want to conduct against ISIS, but they had nothing to do with 9/11. And so you can't legally apply it to those conflicts or any sorts of invasions or actions you would want to launch. And the problem here is that that when you look at the complexity, it seems like people get to the point where they agree that the AUMF should be repealed, but they're so married to these endless wars that they won't do anything to get it off the books.
Right. Yeah, you can support repealing the 2001 if they're going to repeal and replace, which is often the language that you see if they're going to do it, because like the groups are waging the wars against now, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, ISIS-K in Afghanistan, they didn't exist in 2001, so it's kind of hard to use something past then to justify these wars, and so it probably would give them a lot more expansion. Let's move on and talk about, I guess, Matthew Hoh is maybe a good person to bring up next, as we are talking a little bit about the surge, because he's a whistleblower, right? Like he actually came out dissenting against the State Department while he was still working there, to say that the plan that the U.S. was putting in place in Afghanistan at the start of the Obama administration wasn't working. So he is somebody I've talked about a lot on the show, but I haven't really reviewed his story a whole lot from the beginning. So how does Matthew Hoh end up, coming out and saying that this thing isn't going to work?
Yeah, and let me just preface that Matthew Hoh is someone who I'm glad has been able to make the rounds on several podcasts. I was able to host him twice in the last couple of months on my podcast, The Unauthorized Disclosure Show, which I co-host with Ronnie Kallick. And he resigned from the State Department, but he also was a Marine in Iraq. So he has the wartime experience to go along with his professional duty and responsibility that he had as a diplomat for the State Department. And essentially, I'll just read here that he said in his letter, "I have observed that the bulk of the insurgency fights not for the white banner of the Taliban, but rather against the presence of foreign soldiers and taxes imposed by an unrepresentative government in Kabul. The United States military presence in Afghanistan greatly contributes to the legitimacy and strategy message of the Pashtun insurgency." So essentially, this was him in around the time that we were debating a surge for Afghanistan. He comes out in opposition. He says that the strategy is just not working. In fact, it's helping the very people we're claiming to fight, and the insurgency is being helped. The government that's being propped up is illegitimate. The people you have in power don't have the support of the Afghanis or the Afghans on the ground. And so I can't support this any longer as a way of waging this war. I note that he's quoted in Jeremy Scahill's expansive and comprehensive work, Dirty Wars, where he describes how the Joint Special Operations Command Forces were in Afghanistan, chasing after mid-level Taliban leaders who posed no threat to the United States. We found ourselves in this special operations form of attrition warfare. And so essentially, back then, even he could tell, but he recognized that people in our US government wouldn't acknowledge this, that the Taliban's not really the threat. The Taliban are people who you may disagree with their religious fundamentalism, or you may disagree with the authoritarian aims and desires that they have when it comes to ruling over their people. But fundamentally, they do not pose the kind of threat to the United States or neighboring countries in the way that, let's say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS would. Because as we're beginning to learn in the last weeks here, the Taliban is a group that wants to govern Afghanistan. They want respectability. You may not like their ideology, but they do not want to be involved in, massacring and just killing people wantonly. They're not out to just shock people in the way that ISIS or Al-Qaeda would.
Yeah, absolutely. The Taliban just aren't international jihadists and really never have been. You have Scott Horton's book Enough already on your bookshelf behind you too, and in there he explains that Osama bin Laden was really a problem from the Taliban from the beginning, and they didn't really associate with what he was wanting to do, but he ends up launching the attack from there. But it is interesting that it's really only in the past couple of weeks that it's even seeped into the mainstream media at all that the U.S. had any kind of ties with the Taliban to take out ISIS-K, and that ISIS-K and the Taliban aren't friends, although you will still hear people like H.R. McMaster or Matt Spook kind of imply that you never know, they might decide they hate America and team up against us to, try some fear-mongering. I guess one of the things that has to be incredibly frustrating for Matthew Hoh is that, the Afghan papers have since been released by the Washington Post and have really vindicated a lot of what he had to say. But at the time, a lot of people went after him. As far as I can remember, he was one of the first people in uniform. I guess he was at the State Department when he started dissenting, but he's a dude with a beard and was in the military, and he was saying that this wasn't a good idea. And up until then, maybe they had Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, and there was some indication that people were dissenting, but it was Matthew Hoh, and that just seems so significant that it was a vet who in uniform who was saying no to this.
He really stands out as someone opposing the surge. And you mentioned you seem to be alluding to the backlash. So I'll just tell you, and for anyone who's watching who isn't aware, that he did get invited early after he came forward to some of the more establishment media programs. I think he even was able to appear on, let's say, MSNBC or CNN. But David Petraeus was bankrolling a firm that was going around and making calls to these media networks or calling up these media organizations that might want to reference him as a source or use his punditry on the Afghanistan war, draw upon his experience and give him a platform. And because it was a threat to everything that David Petraeus stands for, and that is his failed doctrine of counterinsurgency that has never produced any success. It has zero success rate in the last couple decades that it has been employed by the United States. Because what he was saying was such a threat to David Petraeus, they were trying to keep him off air. And he says he was basically blacklisted. And only recently, he didn't really get invited back onto MSNBC, but he got to do Mehdi Hasan's program on Peacock, which is a streaming service. It's not really MSNBC, but he's sort of, because of the way the Afghanistan war has come to an end here with the withdrawal of U.S. forces, people are starting to be open to that perspective. And you're seeing, I think what you're pointing out here is that there is actually mainstream acceptance for what Matthew Hoh is saying. There's just a lot of people who have conflicts of interest and want to suppress the fact that there is mainstream acceptance. So I think for the last decade, we've been led to believe that this wasn't the consensus because there were a whole lot of people who were war profiteers, or they were devoted to this military doctrine. They were true believers and wanted to see it to the bitter end. And they knew that their reputations would be threatened if everyone knew that this was the mainstream consensus, at least privately. I mean, we've seen it with the Afghanistan papers, and then now it's actually a book that Craig Whitlock has managed to publish. And so you're seeing a bit more of this unraveling. So it's no longer that like David Petraeus and let's say Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations and Richard Engel at NBC News get to be the people who form the narrative. There are other people who get brought in who undermine everything that that we were told about this war.
Yeah, I mean that is a good point, but at the same time, Petraeus still does get on TV, even though aside from being the loser of the Afghan War and not really a great military commander, also disgraced himself and passed very sensitive intelligence to his mistress, and so it's just very interesting where you have this guy Matthew Hoh who I think the journalist who ran his story when he initially leaked it said that one of the reasons she did it was because she talked to everybody and they just had like such high regard for the guy, and he struggles to even get on the streaming service, and still you have people who are disgraced like Petraeus and really shouldn't be in position to talk to the country, and yet he's still on network TV, and just the contrast between the two is unbelievable and frustrating.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'll let you move on to the next person that we have that I highlighted. But obviously, David Petraeus is still a saintly figure to most of the media. We've seen far too much of him for the last month.
Yep. So let's talk about Michael Hastings, who his book, The Operators, I think it's on your shelf behind you, and I got on my shelf as well, really helped me to understand Afghanistan and why counterinsurgency didn't work. Unfortunately, I didn't read it when he put it out, but a few years later, I got a hold of it, and it's just such an important book. And so yeah, talk about Michael Hastings, his book, The Operators, which some people may be more familiar with. It was adopted to the Netflix movie War Machine starring Brad Pitt.
Yeah. So this book was a big deal, and I think it built on his feature story that he put out about Stanley McChrystal. And General Stanley McChrystal, he was doing what journalists do. He was going to the bar and he was sitting there with these generals or these military commanders, and he was having drinks with them while they're involved in prosecuting this war. And he gets Stanley McChrystal to say something that he regrets. I believe he throws some shade or attacked President Barack Obama, the commander-in-chief himself, and he ends up being forced to resign because he violated the decorum that he was supposed to have. But what he really did there isn't as serious as many of the actions that are documented in books like Dirty Wars or are explored by journalists like Michael Hastings. We know he's a huge advocate of the night raids or the JSOC style operations. We hear Joe Biden talking all about these over-the-horizon capabilities of U.S. military forces. This is really something that General Stanley McChrystal pioneered. So this is how we know that in the coming months, we're going to continue to see these special operations forces just jumping into Afghanistan or Pakistan and then jumping out and leaping back to, I don't know, wherever they're going to have bases of operation now that they've lost Afghanistan, because he's the one that came up with it. And it would result in a lot of civilian deaths. There'd be highly questionable intelligence involved. And so, he basically was involved in pushing a lot of truths about the chain of command in the Afghanistan war and where they were failing. But then also, I mention him in my piece because he gave a big platform to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's, I think, up until now, when we had this withdrawal, was largely an unsung hero when it comes to speaking out. He's someone who is mostly forgotten. I mean, if we would talk about people, I don't think he would come up quite as much. And so he's had an opportunity to get his name back out there and share his experience, which was to recognize that the truth on the ground was not matching what people were saying in the press. And he challenged the entire military strategy and said that there's no way it could work. So he's someone who believed in the Afghanistan war, but said what you're doing is it's guaranteed to fail. And he testified. He released this report that was published by Michael Hastings at the Rolling Stones website. And this is an individual who, along with Michael Hastings, they were doing this during President Barack Obama's administration, which, as I already said, that war was dubbed the good war. So anybody who spoke ill of Afghanistan and the operations in Afghanistan was usually pushed aside and ignored.
Yeah. The stories of Hoh and Davis are so important because these are two military figures essentially on each side of the surge. Hoh predicting that wouldn't work, and then Davis essentially confirming what Hoh predicted essentially turned out to be the truth. These guys have done tons of great interviews on their story. I'm sure, I don't know if you've interviewed Danny Davis. I know Scott Horton has, and has gone through his whole story on there if you want to check that out. But one of the great things that he actually went around to all the different areas of Afghanistan while he was a colonel and witnessed that it wasn't working, and then was just did what he was supposed to do and told people about it. And it's just so uncommon in our military that you have people willing to speak out. And Danny Davis is maybe one of the most important voices we have, just because he is on the right and sounds like a tough guy, right? Whenever he speaks, he just kind of has that military command in his voice, and that carries that authority. And when you're speaking that way to the people who even would dismiss, let's say, a Matthew Hoh or a Danny Sherjan, who were both served in Afghanistan, and yet there are people in America on the right who's never travel outside the country who will tell you that those silly commies don't know what they're talking about. That you can't quite dismiss Danny Davis that way, and that's something really important that he brings to the table. And he's continued to speak out against the wars the whole time, and is really has advocated for the U.S. to leave Afghanistan. Was so important. Anything else on Davis or Hastings?
Well, let me just, because we all know Michael Hastings died tragically, and there's one thing that I pulled from a part of his book that's not necessarily directly connected to what he did around Stanley McChrystal, but just in general was an assessment of the Afghanistan war and also a lot of the global war on terrorism, where he wrote, I'm reading, Bin Laden's death revealed the biggest lie of the war, the safe haven myth. Afghanistan's version of WMDs, the concept of waging an extremely expensive and bloody counterinsurgency campaign to prevent safe havens never truly made sense. Terrorists didn't need countries. And I think that's a really important thing for us to all keep in our minds going forward, now that the U.S. no longer has its military bases in Afghanistan, because we're going to hear all this conversation for the next 6 months to a year, especially in order to drag down the choices that the Biden administration made, because the Pentagon really didn't want this withdrawal. And what we're going to hear from the biggest boosters like David Petraeus let me add in another name, Leon Panetta, has been pretty god-awful when it comes to his suggestions that it's a guarantee that Afghanistan is going to become a safe haven for ISIS-K. You have all these people making these wild pronouncements or claims about what will definitely happen, again, without any evidence that that's what the Taliban would want to happen to Afghanistan, without any discussion of why it would be in their interest to allow these extremist groups to destabilize and make it difficult for them to control their country. So I think it's something to keep in mind that this diagnosis that Hastings had earlier on in the war, like 10 years ago at this point, nearly 10 years ago, was really spot on. This idea that we shouldn't be invading countries simply because they're safe havens for terrorists. Terrorists are always going to find places that they can launch their attacks.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's important to bring up. Recently, Paul Wolfowitz had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and Robert Kagan in the Washington Post, and both articles kind of concluded with, boy, imagine if there's another 9/11 now that we left Afghanistan. When, of course, if you look at even the 9/11 plot itself, much of it was plotted in Karachi, Pakistan, which, of course, is a country with heavy ties to the U.S. And Osama bin Laden had hung out in Pakistan for like a decade, which, kind of amazing how the U.S. ally didn't find our most wanted in their country. It was also planned in Hamburg, Germany, in Malaysia, in San Diego. They got their flight training in the U.S. Really, other than Osama bin Laden hanging out in a cave in Afghanistan, when he wasn't, maybe even the most important actor was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's still in Guantanamo Bay. I think they're actually going to try to move his trial forward in this coming week, 20 years after the whole 9/11 thing, but it is just important to remember that this war, it wasn't about Osama bin Laden. And if it was, they probably would have gotten him in Afghanistan before he made it to Pakistan, but they definitely would have found him before 2011. And even then, if it was about Osama bin Laden, it would have ended in 2011, and it didn't. So that's pretty much all the proof you need right there. Let's talk about the WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. Now, of course, there's so much more here than just the Afghan war logs, and we could probably talk for a couple hours, Kevin, on the State Department cables and everything else. But the Afghan war logs, the leads from Chelsea Manning. Let's talk about what that means.
Yeah, so I start with Chelsea Manning, but obviously Julian Assange deserves credit as well, and everyone involved in the publication of these documents at WikiLeaks definitely were courageous in publishing these documents. So U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea, as I quote in my article, again, I'll just read what she was saying. And this is from her court martial. She had an opportunity after she pled guilty to some offenses to say why she felt we needed to see and view this information. So I felt that we were risking so much for people that seemed unwilling to cooperate with us, leading to frustration and anger on both sides. I began to become depressed with the situation that we found ourselves increasingly mired in year after year. So that's that thing that we've heard from a lot of soldiers, right? That people who we were partnering with, maybe that corruption or maybe the lack of morale, or maybe like wondering if they really share our goals and objectives for the country. Hugely difficult. But again, going back to that thing that I think Ron Paul recognized in one of his speeches, which was, on what moral authority do we have to come in there and try and set up a government when we have the record that we have. It's really difficult for us to think that they're going to find us to be people who can come in and organize their society. She added, I believe that if the general public, especially the American public, had access to the information contained within these reports, this could spark a domestic debate on the role of the military and our foreign policy in general. I also believe the detailed analysis of the data over a long period of time by different sectors of society might cause society to reevaluate the need or even the desire to even engage in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations. So when you get the full picture of the war, as you do from looking at these Afghanistan war reports, we could even throw in the Iraq war reports, though we're talking about the Afghanistan war, you get to see how the U.S. military conducts these operations and why they fail, like where they fail. You can even pinpoint days when things are at their worst lows when it comes to the objectives or the efforts on the part of the U.S. military, because it is in that minute detail when you look at this archive of data, and you get to see the civilian deaths that are being hidden from the public, that aren't being in the official counts, which we rarely have released to us, but sometimes they are. And so the other thing with the Afghanistan war logs that were published is that you get things like this incredible story, which is that And this was covered by Nick Davies for The Guardian. I think this is a really important thing for people to recall, that you have these kind of operations going on. And by the way, we didn't know that these kinds of operations were unfolding until we really had these Afghanistan war logs published, that you have these assassination squads essentially that set out with Afghanistan special forces to capture or kill a Taliban commander. And then what will happen is, in this example from October 2007, that they confront Taliban fighters, and then they call in air support to drop 500-pound bombs. And then the carnage that results is, quote, 12 U.S. wounded, 2 teenage girls and a 10-year-old boy wounded, 1 girl killed, 1 woman killed, 4 civilian men killed, 1 donkey killed, a dog killed, several chickens killed, no enemy killed, no enemy wounded, no enemy detained. So a whole lot of innocent people, none of the people we're claiming to fight.
Yeah. And this is backed up even till today. I just read a fantastic new article in the New Yorker by Anand Gopal on like what the war has been like in Helmand, Afghanistan for the past 20 years. And he starts off talking about how prior to the Taliban coming in, there were these warlords that were a real problem for the people living in this village. And then once the U.S. came and got rid of the Taliban, they teamed up with the old warlords that were even worse for the people than the Taliban. And the Afghans were like really shocked by this. They were like, they thought the Americans would at least be better than the Taliban, and it turns out they bring back the people who are even worse. But in that story, he specifically talks about how everybody he talks to has 10 to 12 relatives who they know who just died during this war and whose deaths probably weren't counted. People who were shot by Afghan army snipers, who were killed straight by Afghan army helicopters, had U.S. bombs dropped on them, were shot by Americans or Americans with Afghan allies, just people who are randomly killed, or then just stories of like just people like terrorized in their homes. So Americans come into your home, they break out all of your windows, they sleep there for a night, and that makes your home a target because the enemy is living there, and just the terror that inflicted on all these people. And if it wasn't for the warlords that we got, maybe a lot of this wouldn't even be known. And who knows if Anand Gopal could get this published and if people would believe it, because if you just have Afghans saying that, yeah, Americans are killing my relatives, people write that off pretty easily in America, as saying like, no, they're probably lying, they're trying to get money or something like that. But here's just this guy, Anand Gopal, not handing out money, just asking people to tell their story, and he says that everyone he's talking to says 10 to 12 people just died in one of these horrible ways.
Yeah, and I mean, to what you're saying, and Anand Gopal's book, No Good Men Among the Living, it should be on my shelf behind me, and unfortunately I just couldn't squeeze it in, I suppose. But the way that the last week of our U.S. military being deployed in Afghanistan was marked by, while we're doing this evacuation, was marked by this drone strike that ends up, as far as I can tell, killing only innocent people when we're claiming to be targeting an ISIS-K planner. I mean, that person whose family we killed, I think he was a part of like a nonprofit organization, and they've never produced any evidence even a week to 2 weeks after the strike. I mean, we're recording this on September 7th. I haven't seen any evidence or anything provided to suggest that this person was part of ISIS. And unfortunately, I think that there's just going to be more of the same going forward after, as we maybe continue to wage violence against the Afghanistan people and try to engage in military action on the pretense of protecting the United States from threats. I'm just afraid that more and more innocent people are going to continue to be vaporized in this manner.
Yeah, absolutely. There was some great reporting by Jack Murphy, who's a veteran who talked to a bunch of drone operators recently about how in Helmand, during the Trump years, they were just targeting people who had like radios and things like that because that was a sign that they were potentially with the Taliban. I believe with the strike in Kabul, I read today that the Pentagon was saying that was ordered because they identified a location as they believe it was being tied to ISIS. They saw the car pull in there and they saw some heavy things put in the car. but they had no idea who the driver of the car was or anything like that. And obviously they didn't like pay attention to what was happening because they killed a bunch of children in this, and that's just a horrific nightmare. I'm just, let's talk about Julian Assange real quick, Kevin. And I'm also interested if you could give maybe a quick update on the show. For the past like year or so, I've basically used your articles and Twitter threads to break down what's happening in the trial. But I do know that we have an appeal coming up, I think towards the end of October. And so, just what's going on, and what should we be looking in the news for in the coming weeks and months ahead?
Yeah, I'll give you a good update, and then we can get to Daniel Hale before we wrap up here. But Julian Assange has an appeal hearing coming up in the last week of October. I think it's like 26th, 27th of October. And it'll be a couple days where the United States government gets to appeal the ruling from the district court and essentially argue several things, but primarily that the district judge did not follow the law correctly when she ruled in the extradition case, and that they'll also be arguing things like they don't believe Julian Assange is at risk of suicide, or that he would be treated totally and completely humanely if he was put in a U.S. prison, something that we know based on all of the evidence that we have and other lawsuits that we've seen brought against the Bureau of Prisons is something without basis. But they're going to try to defend the United States' mass incarceration system before this 3-judge panel called the High Court of Justice. And we'll see. They also get to attack a neuropsychiatrist who's well respected, did most of the work as a doctor treating Julian Assange and assessing his condition. And they're going to try to discredit him because he did not disclose that Julian Assange had a relationship with his partner, Stella Morris, who is also doing work for the Julian Assange legal team. And then, of course, as you know, they had children in the Ecuador embassy together, and those were not public at the time or from the beginning of this case. And they were not known to the judge or the prosecutors until, I believe, March or April of 2020. So they're going to use that to try and impeach and discredit this doctor, because one of the things he said that was really crucial to saving Julian's life is that he has these impulses to commit suicide, which he's unable to control because of his mental health disorder. So this is an important couple of days. Julian Assange's team definitely want to win, but if they lose, it's not the worst thing, because no matter what, this is going to go before the UK Supreme Court, where that will be the ultimate decision.
Okay, so it seemed like the last one, the last appeal didn't necessarily go in his favor, and the U.S. did get, or I guess the UK got more room to prosecute him on.
Well, it was a pretrial. It was a pretrial hearing, so we haven't had the formal appeal hearing yet. Okay. And essentially what they were able to do is just say they should be able to argue whatever they want, and the judges are going to consider it. They were trying to limit the types of arguments they could make, and in the end, they said, well, we'll just let you argue whatever, and we'll make our decision based on the law. And so we'll see if that helps the United States. I'm not sure if it favors or doesn't favor Julian Assange. Like a lot of people looked at that outcome and they said, well, it could be bad for Julian Assange. Or it could be the UK High Court of Justice just knows that the US is going to throw their weight around no matter what, and they want to just let them do whatever they please. And then they'll just tell them with the decision, like Judge Vanessa Barretzer did, that they're not going to allow the extradition.
Yeah, and so a lot of it, I guess, at this point hinges on Julian Assange's autism diagnosis, because there is like precedent cases in the UK of them denying extradition based on the autism diagnosis.
With mental health, yeah. So like Lori Love and there was Gary McKinnon, both of them were actually accused of hacking. Julian Assange did not engage in hacking, but these were people who were alleged to have committed hacking offenses and were never brought to the United States because there was evidence that if they were incarcerated, they would not survive.
All right, Kevin, let's wrap up. Our last person here is Daniel Hale, who is currently, I guess, in prison, correct? And serving, what, 40-something months?
He got 45 months, but ultimately he'll probably only be in prison for, let's say, 18 of those months. So that's good, just because of good time credit. I think he's going to be in a substance abuse program, which can take off a year of time that you're incarcerated. But still, that's 45 months too many for somebody who is a Afghanistan war veteran who was involved in the drone program, who released these drone papers to Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept. And it exposed that in things like in a 5-month span of time, 90% of the people being killed were civilians, and they weren't terrorists or alleged terrorism suspects at all. We have lots of information that he disclosed related to the watch list, the way that people get put on the watch list. His document was used to try and get people who are on the no-fly list off of the no-fly list. With some success, people were able to remove their names. It's a big deal. But then, in addition, he's showing in his documents that the drone strikes that are being launched are just not killing the people that our government is claiming. And the standard that's being used is not reflected in what President Barack Obama was telling us. You have President Barack Obama saying that the people who are being targeted pose an imminent threat to the United States. But in fact, in his unit, there's a much looser standard, which is if they pose any threat to any interest of the United States, then, or if they get in the way of any interest of the United States, then they could be targets of the U.S. military, which is much different than whether they pose a threat to you or me or some other part of the United States. So that's a lie. And he exposed a lot of this. He challenged this. He gave quite a moving speech in court. He's quite an admirable whistleblower, in my opinion, but he's being put in prison for the disclosure of these documents. And he's actually been kept in limbo. I don't know if he's made it to the federal prison where he'll be held, but he was in a transfer facility with like 100 or so other men for at least a month and just waiting to be put where he's going to be held, which is just very gross to me. It's another part of the way we wage war on our whistleblowers, and another example of how these cases don't end when somebody pleads guilty and is sentenced to prison. I've done a lot of work following the way whistleblowers get treated in these prisons, whether we're talking about him or CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou did a time in prison. And recently we got to see hear from Terry Albury, who is an FBI whistleblower who has a lot of good things to share about FBI religious profiling and the way they go after informants and target people with surveillance. And so it doesn't end because they plead guilty. They go to prison and they go through mistreatment. And that's part of why Julian Assange doesn't want to be extradited to the United States, because he knows about the harsh treatment that lies ahead for whistleblowers. And then now we're using the same law to go after whistleblowers in order to go after journalists who are not who do not cater to the establishment narratives.
So, Kevin, one of the things about Daniel's story that confused me when I first heard that he got arrested was that he was a national bird. And I remember watching that movie 5 years ago or so, and I was really confused as to how he was just got arrested and how he goes through, I guess, a good chunk of the Obama administration and Trump administration without being targeted at all, and then he ends up getting arrested at the end of the Trump administration, prosecuted, and then sentenced finally under Biden. So I mean, why did they leave? Do we have any idea why they left him alone for so long and why they suddenly just snatched him up?
Yeah, it's because of the change in policy in the Trump administration to accelerate and ramp up the number of leak prosecutions that were pursued. And so there's actually a document that was uncovered by his defense when they were putting together their case. They were planning to go to trial initially, but a lot of times you end up deciding not to go to trial because you can't put on a public interest defense in court and say why you released the documents. So he did plead guilty to a charge, and they didn't need to necessarily use this document, but they found that there were higher ranking officials in the Justice Department that did not want to bring charges against Daniel Hale, that cautioned against doing so in the National Security Division. And so then the case just sat there, and it wasn't closed, but it was there, and he had this cloud hanging over him. But as you're saying, it wasn't until 2019, which is 4 or 5 years later, that we had an indictment issued. And actually, the indictment comes almost around the same time that Julian Assange is indicted, or the indictment against him is released to the public. Just a month later, that's when Daniel Hale was indicted. And so it's part of this policy that the Trump administration had to go after people like Julian Assange and Daniel Hale. And I don't even know exactly why Obama, who has this reputation of being involved in the war on whistleblowers, didn't want to charge Daniel Hale, or why people would have protected him from another political case like this one. However, I will say, and this is my theory, there were a lot of us that called him things like President Kill List or the drone warrior in chief. And perhaps he didn't want to have this as part of his legacy, that Daniel Hale was prosecuted under his watch. So it just sat there, and for the same reasons they wouldn't go after Assange, there might have been very similar reasons for not going after Daniel Hale.
All right. Well, thanks for all this, Kevin, and tell people about what you do. I've been following Shadowproof for a long time. My friend Joanne Leone introduced it to me like 5 or 6 years ago, and I've been reading it ever since. But now I know you have something too, The Dissenter, and then you got a couple podcasts. So just tell people where the best places to follow you are to get caught up with everything you're doing.
Yeah, I'm very active. So for your viewers who have just heard this hour of conversation, which I thank you for, go to thedissenter.org, thedissenter.org, thedissenter.org. And it's a free newsletter that you can subscribe to, where you get all sorts of updates on whistleblower stories, as well as the latest with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's case. And then I co-host a podcast with Rania Khalek called Unauthorized Disclosure. So I think those would be of most interest to your listeners and viewers. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Kevin.